Lettering can be daunting, but as long as you use guidelines and measurements, your work will look really polished. We're going to go through the process of measuring and writing words evenly, and then have them conform to different shapes and see how that affects the word as well. Use the same word for all 6 examples so that you can compare them. My sketchbook pages are 5.5 inches by 8.5 inches, and I wanted 6 equal spaces across 2 pages. This doesn't have to be perfectly measured, just make sure that each area is at least 2.5 inches by 5.5 inches. That way you won't have anything too close to the edges of the area on any side. Any 5-letter word is fine, and I used sleep. The words are 5 inches wide, that way each letter can be 1 inch for easy measurement. I also don't have the words any higher than 2 inches, so that the halfway can be at 1 inch. At the bottom of your first section, draw a line 5 inches long. Have it generally centered so that no side is touching the edge of the paper. Make small marks up at each inch, including the beginning of the ruler. Turn your paper and draw straight lines upward to make 5 even sections. I lined the end of my ruler up to the top of my paper to make sure that the lines were straight up and down. Don't worry about making them all the same length right now. On the left side, line your ruler up so that the 2-inch mark is at the first line that you drew. Make small marks up at 0 and 1 inch. Repeat this on the other end, and then line those marks up to have straight lines across. You should have 10 1 by 1 inch squares at this point. We will use these as guidelines for letters just like before. I erased back my middle line a bit so that I can see it, but I don't have to worry about erasing it later. First, write each letter in normally. I like to think of this as the bones of the letters. This way I can quickly make adjustments if I need to, and I haven't committed to anything just yet. Each letter needs to stay inside its area, and they must touch the top and bottom guidelines. If a letter has a middle part that needs to line up, then it should be at the middle guideline, like the E's and P in this case. Then I use the general sketch of the letter to carefully make block letters. I'm keeping the letters fairly skinny for mine. Try your best to keep things consistent and clean. It's good to start drawing very lightly with your guidelines and basic shape. That way, later you can use a heavier pressure to go ahead and finalize your letters and make any adjustments as necessary without having to worry too much about erasing. Even something just as simple as moving your middle guideline up or down can change the font and give it a different look. Now we're going to play around with different shapes and see how that affects the word. Again, at your next section, draw another 5-inch line across near the bottom and make a mark up at each inch. This time, on the left side, you'll need to make a line up only 1 inch, and you'll make your halfway mark at 1/2 inch. On the right side of the word, draw your line 2 inches tall like last time, with your midpoint at 1 inch again. Once you have those points, line up the 2 top points and draw an angled line across, and then line up the 2 midpoints and draw the line across for those as well. This should make a shape that is shorter on the left side and taller on the right side. Then line up your ruler again and make the rest of your vertical lines at the 1-inch marks. You should still line up the end of your ruler to either the top or bottom of the paper to make sure that your lines are straight up and down. Just like last time, start drawing in the bones of your letters. They do still need to touch the top and bottom of this guideline, and you'll notice that especially as the letters get further towards the right, that they will be a little bit more stretched and distorted. The E's in particular, you need to pay attention to the angle of those lines. The very bottom of the L and both E's are going to be flat and horizontal, but the 2 upper lines of both E go along the angle of the top and middle line. Make sure that you're following the guidelines so that way everything is correct and you get the full effect of this technique. Once the letters are in the right place, go ahead and make them into block letters again. I'm trying to keep mine as consistent as possible in the thickness, so that way really what I'm seeing is the difference in the shape and not really the difference in the font itself. The next shape will be flat on the bottom again, so draw another 5-inch line across towards the bottom of your next section. Make your small lines up at each inch, starting at 0 and ending at 5. The front and back end of this shape are going to have lines that go up 1 inch. Put your ruler back at the bottom line and make a tiny dot where 2.5 inches is for our halfway point. Line your ruler up so that you can make a mark 2 inches above that midpoint. This will be a guideline when you draw the upper curve. Very lightly sketch out the curve, aiming towards that midpoint, and then back down to the other side. Then you can darken the line and make the curve a lot more neat. Then draw your vertical lines for each letter. For the midline, make a mark at 1/2 inch at the front and back of your shape. And then in the middle, you need to make a mark at 1 inch. Again, these are guidelines, so that way you can get a fairly even curve from one side to the other. After you have all of your guidelines in, then go ahead and draw the bones of your letters. The top and middle of these letters are not going to be angled, but curved slightly, either up or down. And finally, make block letters, just like last time. Again, try to keep things as consistent as possible. I'm keeping all of my letters thin, so that way I can see the difference in the shape that they are in, not the difference of the font. At the bottom of the next section, draw another 5-inch line across with marks at each inch. On the right side of the shape, draw another line up that is 2 inches long, and on the left side of the shape, the line should be 1.5 inches. The top of this shape is going to be like a wave. I start from the center and draw over to the right, a curve upward. Then, going back to the very front of the shape, I curve down towards the middle to meet up. Again, it's okay if it's not perfect, but just draw very, very lightly, and then later you can always darken it up and clean the line. Then I drew the vertical lines for the space for each letter. For the midline, I tried to stay the same distance away from the top curve and use that as a guideline to try and get that as close as I could. When mapping out the letters for this one, you'll notice that the tops of all the letters are about the same height, but then the bottoms of the letters get squished down or stretched out, depending on where on the curve they are. Also, the top and midpoint obviously are curved in different directions depending on where it is. And here I'm still using the same block letter font, so that way we can really see the difference in how the shape affects the word instead of the font. Next, we're making a diamond. So you'll actually need to make your horizontal line right in the center of your next section. I lined up the end of my ruler to the edge of my paper, making sure that my line is perfectly horizontal. Then moved my ruler over so that I could make my 5-inch wide line and make a mark where the center is at 2.5 inches. After that, I need a vertical line that is 1 inch above and below my center line. So I lined my ruler up where my midpoint is at 1 inch and just drew from 0 to 2 inches very, very lightly because this is going to get erased. To make the outside of the diamond, I lined up all of the outer points and made diagonal lines between them, then went back to my center horizontal line to make the marks every 1 inch. I didn't really do the vertical lines for this one for each letter. I just tried to keep it inside the zone for each one and generally drew the bones in again. You'll notice for this one that things are starting to get really squished with the S and the P at the front and back end. The L looks a little funky because the bottom, instead of being flat, is down at an angle. The middle E is kind of interesting though, actually, because it has the point up and down at the top and then down back up at the bottom. The other E, the top and bottom are just getting squeezed a little bit. So this really is where you're starting to see using these shapes to have the letters really take the form of whatever that shape is. So we definitely wanted to try some more simple ones at the beginning, so that way once you get to the point where you're really changing the shape of those letters, that you know what you need to do. The next shape will start very similarly. You're going to draw in the middle of the next section your 5-inch line and make small marks up every inch to show how wide the letters will be. Next, I drew a very, very light line up, just barely touching the paper, from 2.5 inches. Again, to give myself an idea of where that center point needs to be, but so that I don't really have to erase it later. I made my marks where above the line was 1 1/8 inches and below 1 1/8 inches. I just made a tiny, tiny dot on each of those. Then I very lightly sketch out going from point to point and try to get as neat and even of an oval as I can. It's okay if it's not perfect, but the lighter you do it the first time, then later you can use more pressure and darken the outline of the oval. And that way it'll look really clean. Again, I drew the vertical lines so that I knew how wide my letters needed to be, and then begin sketching in the bones of those letters along the guidelines. Obviously, instead of having strong angles, there will be curves for the tops and bottom. Now that you've seen this applied with the same font throughout different shapes, this time I wanted to kind of think about how the font itself can also mimic the shape and give a little bit more of the idea of the word that we're looking at too. So instead of block letters, this time I did bubble letters. There's this round pillow shape of the word itself, and having the words rounded and soft gives a little bit more idea of sleep and some comfort to that word as well. So when you're looking at this in a design aspect, considering what kind of font and what shapes you're using for certain words can also give your viewer a different idea or feel that can relate to the word itself. For this last example, I wanted to take that thought a step further. I drew my 5-inch line across the center again, making small marks at each inch. My letters will stay the same width, but for the outline, I decided to freehand an organic cloud shape just to see how it would look. I ended up really liking that the center line on the letters was all the same, but then the tops and bottoms were uneven and gave a really unique look to the font. I just played around adding some serifs until I felt that it was done.